Hello and welcome. I'm Bloomberg TV anchor Caroline Hyde. And on behalf of Bloomberg, on behalf of Open to Debate, thank you for tuning in to this debate. We're here in London, kicking off the Bloomberg Tech Conference. And it is here, on European soil, that we address a debate that's been bubbling up in the past few years. Look, there's a question that looms about Europe's future in a moment when so much appears to hinge on the development, on the manufacturing, on the design of something that's so small that it easily fits into the palm of your hands. Look, at times it just fits onto the tip of your fingertip. I'm talking about chips, not the ones that you like with a bit of fish and mushy peas. No, semiconductors. The chips that are in your phones and your televisions and your computers, they are driving the AI revolution. To be a global player these days, chips are pretty necessary. And with the most complicated supply chain perhaps ever seen, they are also a source of global tension. They're a source of global alliances, and some would go as far to say that they are a source of a chip war. Which brings us to our topic tonight. With the United States leading in design and cloud computing, and China dominating mining and processing of raw materials, of course Taiwan, which is being a critical source of manufacturing, Europe has found itself ever more reliant on other regions than perhaps feels kind of comfortable. Should Europe try to catch up? Can it catch up? Well, that is what we are debating tonight with four superbly qualified debaters. We're going to tackle this very question. Is Europe too late to compete in the chip war? Now, before I bring in our debaters onto this stage, I want to ask our audience sat right here at the Bloomberg Tech Conference to weigh in on where they currently sit on this question. We'll poll now, and then we're going to poll again. And we're going to see perhaps which side has persuaded the most people to change their mind. They are going to be declared the winner. Now, at past debates hosted by Open to Debate, we've actually seen as many as a third of our audience change their minds. So good luck to the debaters. And without further ado, please let's do welcome them to the stage. Arguing yes to the question, Center on Regulation in Europe Director of Research, Zach Meyers, Center for New American Security Senior Fellow, Geoffrey Gertz. Arguing no to the question, Eurostack co-founder, Cristina Caffarra, and Caffarra CEO, Baissus. Now, we start with our opening statements. So first up, here to convince us that Europe is too late, we have Zach Meyers. Zach is Director of Research at the Center on Regulation in Europe, a think tank focused on industry regulation. He's also an expert in competition and digital regulation and has brought that expertise to bear as a consultant to both governments and private sector. Zach, we're so delighted to have you here. Please do take it away. Why is it too late for Europe in the chip war?
Thank you so much for having me. The chip war is a battle for dominance, control, or at least influence over global semiconductor supply chains. And there are two players in this war right now, the US and China. The US is spending $280 billion to grow its semiconductor industry, and President Trump has one priority, which is to make other countries as dependent as possible on US chip technology. On China's part, it's spending $150 billion to build its own entirely self-sufficient chip supply chain. Europe, with its €43 billion Chips Act, is not playing in the same league. We are not on the trajectory to build our own chip ecosystem, and in fact, we're falling further and further behind. Let me give you three examples. Firstly, the EU has just had to agree to purchase $40 billion worth of American AI chips, which is money that we could otherwise be spending supporting European chip companies like Caffarra. Secondly, under the recent EU-US trade deal, we've had to accept that America is going to impose 15% tariffs, potentially much more, as President Trump has recently threatened. When European chips get sold in America, none will apply the other way around. And finally, we need to look at the level of investment. Over the last 2 years, European investment in chip manufacturing was $116 billion, which sounds impressive, except when you hear the figures for the US and Asia, $540 billion and $884 billion. So let's be clear that Europe is not a competitor in the chip war today. But we also need to be clear about one other thing. Given where we are, exacerbating the chip war, trying to compete in it, is not in Europe's interests. Europe actually has huge strengths and opportunities in the chip supply chain, which I'm sure we're going to talk about. And it has enormous opportunities to expand. But these are complementary to what other countries are doing. And what that means is that Europe has to preserve open markets, which is the opposite of what the chip war is trying to do. Secondly, even if we wanted to compete in the chip war, it would take valuable funds and resources away from bigger priorities for Europe. Our dependencies in the tech supply chain are humongous. They cover cloud computing, operating systems, AI models, productivity software, and even more importantly, we are entirely dependent on the US for defense. If Europe wants more control over its future, then we have a lot to do and we have extremely stretched public budgets to do that with. We can't keep attempting to do everything everywhere all at once. Now, this doesn't mean that Europe's position is hopeless. Very, very far from that. The US and China actually show us something really important. Subsidies and public money cannot always buy you a technological lead. China, for example, can't replicate Europe's technology in making chip-making tools. The US can't build the same cutting-edge chips that Taiwan can. So technological leads can be incredibly difficult to dislodge. So instead of throwing money around widely, we should be really laser-focused on the areas where we have a technological lead and make sure we keep it. And we should build partnerships with other countries that have what we need. This more open approach is 100% part of Europe's DNA. The EU is based around this idea that if you insist on absolute sovereignty and self-sufficiency, then you are going to be weaker, and you'll be stronger when you can rely on other countries. Most of the rest of the world, including important chip-making areas like Taiwan, do not want to be forced into the US-China chip war. So we need to work with them and focus on our strengths, not just our weaknesses. We need to stop imitating and double down on innovating.
Thank you. Zach, great opening statement. Next to give their opening remarks, this time to argue it's not too late for Europe to compete, is chip maker himself, Eric Baissus. Eric is the CEO of Caffarra. It's a French chip company. They make processors and acceleration cards that serve AI. He'll describe exactly what that is. Eric transitioned to the company when he took it from startup to scale up in his decade as leader. Before Caffarra, Eric spent 8 years at Texas Instruments, leading the development of chip designs. Eric, we're so pleased to have you here. Thank you for joining, and tell us why it's not too late.
Thank you very much. Yes, it's not too late. So let me explain why. First, I'm very glad to be here. In a way, I'm here to represent more than 200,000 of talents in Europe, in the European semiconductor industry. People investing, developing lithography machine from ASML, new type of architecture from ARM, machine from STMicro. I'm here also to represent hundreds of startups or scale-up company like us, but also like Mistral, like ZML, like OpenChip, like Cypel, who are investing with leading research centers like Cera, IMEC, Fraunhofer. So all of these companies are based in Europe, and we're building the future of semiconductor. Now, introducing myself based on my experience, you will see that I'm here not to talk about theory. I'm not an analyst, I'm an entrepreneur. So I want to share with you reality, business reality, what I live every day. As an entrepreneur for the last 20 years, what I learned is in our industry, what is the most important is barriers to entry. So the key question we should ask ourselves is, are these guys, or these wonderful US companies, and some of the Chinese companies, investing billions and billions and billions, are they building barriers to entry that will prevent any newcomer to catch up? This is the real question. So let's go through all the barriers to entry that this guy say they are building. First one, access to talent. Is there a barrier to access to talent? There are thousands of world-class talents in Europe. Europe is very strong in AI, in mathematics, right? Even better than that, thanks to the geopolitical climate, European talents, they want to stay in Europe or return to Europe. Second barrier, is there a barrier to access to advanced technology? Nope. I've been designing AI chip for years. The reality is that it's not easy, but it's not rocket science. The components are available. HBMs are available. Okay. Process are available. Okay. So it's not such a difficulty. Once NVIDIA deployed the technology, this technology is available for the rest of the world. Is there a barrier of entry in terms of software, developer community? Answer is yes. Yes, there is, but not for long. Open source is winning. Open standards, AI framework are spreading over and are challenging NVIDIA de facto proprietary standard called CUDA, which has been actually one of the main reasons why NVIDIA is so successful. What next? What are the next barriers to entry that we will face in the future? Actually, it will be very different. It will not be about performance. It will be about access to massive green power energy. It will be about optimizing power consumption. It will be about building an AI we trust, we enjoy working with, sharing our value. All of these are skill sets that Europe owns. So I'm a strong believer that actually the market is open and that Europe has all the assets to be extremely successful thanks to this new market, which is AI.
Eric, thank you very much indeed. Look, we are halfway through our opening statements now. Let's bring Geoffrey Gertz. Jeff is a former director for international economics at the White House under President Biden. He is also a senior advisor to the State Department's Bureau for Cyberspace and Digital Policy. He's currently a senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security with a focus on energy, economics, and security. Jeff, you have 4 minutes to argue why it is too late for Europe.
Wonderful. Thank you, Caroline, and thank you to Bloomberg and Open for Debate for having us. So I'll make 3 quick points as we kick off here. Start with some bad news, then some good news, and end on a warning. So let's start with the bad news. There's no realistic path for Europe to emerge as a challenger to the United States and China in the chip war. If we look both at the landscape today, but also especially where things are going in the next 5 to 10 years, there's no path where Europe is catching up to the US and China, and if anything, they're likely to fall further behind. So let's start on China. China is deeply committed to building its own autonomous indigenous chip supply chain. Really, this has been an ambition for some time, but particularly since the export controls that the United States and Netherlands and Japan jointly imposed on China 3 years ago, it is clear that it is a top national priority for China to have an indigenous chip supply chain, and they're going to put as much money as it takes into this ambition. So China, over time, is going to be making more and more of its own semiconductors, more of its own semiconductor equipment, and they're going to be buying less from the rest of the world, including from Europe, and trying to sell their own goods around the world. Meanwhile, if we look across the Pacific Ocean in the United States, we see this sort of massive new drive to build AI data centers, both domestically and then to export the AI stack abroad. So there's huge demand for AI chips, which is driving these sort of incredible valuations of US semiconductor companies and making them the most valuable companies in the world. Now, certainly this US system, unlike in China, is not closed off. It has sort of real opportunities and frankly real dependencies on other partners, kind of Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and very importantly, Europe are all part of this broader US supply chain. But really, if we look at, we have these 2 different chip supply chains that today are global leaders and that over the next 5, 10 years are going to be embarking on a massive new buildup. So really, they're going to be pulling further and further away from the rest of the world, including Europe. I don't think Europe has any interest or ability to keep up with US and Chinese investment here. So that's the bad news. But let me turn to the good news, because the good news is Europe does not need to choose between going all in on a chip war and competing with the US and China versus just a sort of complete technological colonialism kind of seed the entire sector. There's a third path, there's a middle way here, which is that Europe can double down on its strengths, realize these sort of specific areas where it does have particular comparative advantage, and become an indispensable player in global semiconductor supplies. So in practice, what does this mean? 3 things. I think first, identifying the true vulnerabilities that Europe has, and there are real vulnerabilities here. We've seen over the last few weeks, China's action on critical rare earths is a true vulnerability where Europe needs to get its act together, frankly, along with the United States and other countries around the world. So focus on vulnerabilities, come up with real strategies. These strategies may or may not involve actual domestically production. I think there's a kind of friend-shoring agenda here where we can make a lot of progress, but that's sort of the first step. Second, again, focus on Europe's own comparative advantages. Where are the strengths? Advanced machinery, R&D, there are things that Europe is doing very well at the moment and can sort of continue to invest in, again, becoming indispensable to other partners around the world. And then third, develop a diplomatic strategy for working with others. Again, the Japan, South Koreas, kind of Taiwans of the world, other sort of middle powers that do not want to be squeezed out of the chip supply chain between the US and China, they are natural partners for Europe, and Europe needs to sort of turn to them and work with them. So finally, let me close here with a warning, because I do think the stakes are very high on this. And there is a real risk that if Europe goes down a more sort of inward-looking, we'll do everything ourselves and sort of build it all ourselves, this is going to not only be unachievable, but it's going to backfire. It's going to provoke both the United States, but frankly also Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, other partners, who are going to say, why is Europe turning away from us? They're sort of kicking us out of the European market. We need to sort of avoid that outcome. That's going to be really difficult. So let me close there. Thank you.
Geoffrey, thank you. 7 seconds to go. We appreciate it. Thank you. And finally, taking the position that it's not too late for Europe to compete in the chip war is Cristina Caffarra. Cristina is an economist, honorary professor at University College London, and co-founder and chair of the Eurostack initiative. That is a movement that brings together tech, governance, and funding to work towards European tech independence at every level, including chip production. Cristina, it's your turn to make the case.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you for having me. So the topic of today's debate is, in fact, a common tech trope, especially from non-European and from tech giants. Europe is too late to compete at X, and you can replace X with almost anything in the digital sphere, hardware, software, and connectivity. And in chip, the story goes, as we heard, well, Europe used to account in some mythical times for 50% of global semiconductors. They're now less than 10%. It has fallen from grace. We heard it. Let us do it for you. Just concentrate on the little cute things that you can do, and we will help you. You do the kind of things that are complementary and don't challenge us. So, of course, indeed, the loss of first mover advantage has been the story of European tech. And Europe was a trailblazer, a pioneer in so many sectors, and is now a digital colony, which is why we need something like Eurostack to reverse this decline. But let's kind of think, what does it mean, can Europe compete in the chip wars? What does compete in the chip wars means? Does it mean can we meet our own entire chip demand from a wholly domestic value chain? What chips? Because chips is not one thing. There is a huge array of chip sizes and application. Does it mean can we export the chips? What does it mean? The narrative that comes from over there is, well, you little cute ones, you can't afford to invest all these billions that the Americans and the Chinese can do. You got a few pennies. What can you do? Let's just content yourself. This is not realism or pragmatism. This is gaslighting of Europe, and it is certainly a way of psyching us out. Now, there are complicated political economy reasons why Europe, which once was a pioneer, is not playing in the same league as the big industry giant. And in a world in which we were all living, which was a world of free trade and globalization, that was okay. Because in a way, you have comparative advantages and regionalization. We learned that is vulnerability with COVID, and now we live in a profoundly transformed geopolitical landscape with export controls, economic coercion, supply disruptions, leading everyone, not just Europe or the United States or China, absolutely everyone to redirect and rethink, reconfigure, to improve resilience, to improve some measure of independence for everyone. At the same time as a massive technological shift is happening, because we are no longer in the world in which we have a certain size chips, but the technological demand is shifting towards smaller cuts, smaller architectures, below 5 nodes for specific uses, AI and cars and defense and so on. So we are in a gold rush for sure, in which everyone is investing a lot, 2-3 trillions overall in semiconductors in the next decades. US is throwing money at it. Certainly Taiwan is, certainly Korea, certainly Japan. Let's not forget, China is throwing money at it, but they are technologically constrained. They're big in the big legacy mature chips, not in the new advanced chips. So let's also not psyche ourselves up with terror. Yes, Europe has got 10% of fabrication, but there are two main things. One, a very different landscape today, which requires us to move towards more independence. We have cars. Cars are €1 trillion in GDP, 13 million people. Cars are transitioning towards a very different technological environments. Europe is not going to give up on car. Car is an imperative. Defense is an imperative. AI is an imperative. Investment will continue. And then we have superpowers. Superpowers in design, superpowers in lithography. ASML is the king, which everybody needs. So in short, it is not remotely true that there is a competition in which we need to be absolutely of the same size. I'll leave it there.
Cristina. Just 15 seconds or so over. We appreciate the opening statements, and we know where both of you now stand and why. But I'm just in this moment going to summarize a little bit from perhaps Zach starting off with ultimately just the size and the scale of the money we're talking here. And I think that was a great place to start. The idea that 280 billion already from the US, and you put that into comparison with 43 billion coming from Europe. But it's really not in the interest from your perspective for Europe to compete. And we should be relying on these open markets. Maybe that's a little bit of a moment where we still say, well, are we still in a moment where we can depend on globalization? I think we should thrash out a little bit of the very need for digital sovereignty, if that is in this moment that we need it. Because Geoff went on to talk about the bad, the good, and the warnings, really talking about China's mission of making their own supply chain completely of their own, US desire to export their entire tech stack and make everyone dependent on it. But really thinking about maybe at this moment, maybe we don't need to be thinking about being focused on having this level of indispensability across the entire chip chain, but maybe there are areas that we can focus and leverage in on. So maybe this is about the art of diplomacy. But then we go across to Cristina and Eric's point, and Cristina is, we don't want to be leaning on this moment of diplomacy because globalization is under attack, and maybe that is why we need this moment of sovereignty. You make the point of a digital colony, which I think we can lean in on a little bit more as well, but also helping set frame of what competition really means for you. Does it mean meeting our own demand? Can you do that with 10% of fabrication? Is it about exporting? Is that what we need? But really, it feels as though you are at this moment pro-sovereignty. And Eric, I mean, really to help outline some of the players that have shown the edge in Europe already. We talk about them day in and day out here on the show and across all of Bloomberg News. On my Bloomberg Tech show, we talk about STMicro, ARM, ASML, and many others throughout the day. We talk about, of course, the building the future of semiconductors. And I'd love to get from you a little bit about how we are thinking of the transition. Tech, as you say, involves many parts of the ecosystem. Is it about defense? Is it about autos? Where are your chips in particular going? But talking about some of the barriers to entry and whether they really are barriers to entry. Do we have the talent? Do we have the ability to innovate and be able to open source? And do we have the ability to also power and the green power edge that Europe has? So there's some of the key issues that I heard. What I'd love to know from both of you, and I'm going to perhaps lean in a little bit more onto Geoff, where you took us on whether or not we need digital sovereignty in this moment. You say that diplomacy is where Europe can play its edge. Well, at the moment, we're hearing about the story of Nexperia, which is the Dutch company that got bought by a Chinese one, and then suddenly the Dutch are having to say that the Chinese are not going to have access to their tech. We're seeing that China is currently having to extricate itself, and the CEO's been removed. It's a torrid story that's unfolding in front of our eyes, but more broadly, can the Dutch navigate that at this moment? Because that is a key question of diplomacy. At the moment, it doesn't feel like it's going well for either side.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Nexperia case really shows both the geopolitical stakes here, as well as the importance of a nimble and diplomatic Europe to navigate these choppy waters. So I think if you look at Nexperia, right, to me, it's clear that we are seeing now these sort of risks of allowing China to buy up Nexperia sort of 5 years ago. That was a mistake made 5 years ago that, frankly, if I were advising the government, they should have gone back and fixed that problem a long time ago, but we are here where we are. It is clear that Europe cannot depend on China for its chip supplies. It is clear that it is a bad situation for Europe to be in, of sort of sending all of its chips to China to get packaged and then come back here. So I kind of agree with that, and maybe we sort of agree across the stage on that. The question, though, is sort of, how much does Europe want to actually bring inside and how much can it bring inside? And again, there's going to be clear limits to this. Europe is not in a position that it can dominate global supply chains. It's not a position that it can bring it all inside. It's going to have to be very selective in picking and choosing how it wants to focus on aspects and slices of the semiconductor supply chain rather than covering the full stack. And that means it is going to have to work with partners. It's going to have to work with Japan, Korea, Taiwan's of the world, but also critically, it's going to have to work with the United States. Now, look, I recognize the United States is not an easy partner to work with. That is very obvious at the moment. But I think, frankly, both in Washington and in Brussels, the two sides are going to have to work together on these things because, frankly, neither of them is big enough to take on China by itself. But together they can.
Eric, you are a man who probably has to navigate already being a diplomat, already sourcing some of your parts and your manufacturing process from other countries. Do you think that you can rely on yourself and Europe to continue to have access in that way? Are you worried about access to certain parts of your supply chain from China?
Well, I think it's not about just China. It's about countries outside Europe. And I think anyway, for sure, Europe will not be able to do everything by itself. That's for sure. Okay. So the point is not about replacing all the potential industry and to have them back in Europe. I think the point is to have a fair part of the game, to have a fair part of the cake also. I really feel insulted when these guys they say, hey, why don't you play with you in your sandbox, right? Let us do it. Let's do it. But let me ask you a question. US are very good for fabless design. Excellent. Very bad in terms of manufacturing, right? Why don't US focus on fabless design? Why such a pressure to have manufacturing capabilities in US? I don't understand. So your recommendation for Europe is not applied for US? Why? Is stopping, and the reason why we've got this Xperia actually experience is because Europe is getting nervous. We are getting nervous. We feel insulted. We need to react, we have to react, and we will react.
Answer that therefore for us a bit, Zach, as to the US does at the moment have this focus on having others, TSMC, Samsung, kind of manufacture in the United States, but also it wants to inject Intel to be able to build once and manufacture in the United States once again. Why shouldn't Europe be doing the same thing, having their own manufacturing as well as their own design, as well as having the whole food chain in the same way as the US seems to be pushing for?
Well, I mean, the US is starting from a completely different position to Europe. It has Intel, it has a US company that knows how to manufacture chips and has done a fairly good job, even though it's faced difficulties in recent years. Whereas in Europe, when we're trying to encourage particularly cutting-edge manufacturing, we're encouraging TSMC, we're encouraging Intel. These
and then
are
Intel
American
pulls out. Can you give that
Taiwanese
context?
companies into Europe. This is not helping European sovereignty. It's giving money to foreign companies. So, I mean, the other factor, of course, is energy costs, which are a really important factor to consider in terms of whether you're going to be globally competitive in manufacturing chips. And Europe is far behind here. We are, reliant on imported LNG. We're at a structural disadvantage. And thirdly, we just don't have the public funds. So, I mean, Europe is heavily indebted. France is at the point of a budget crisis at the moment. Even Germany's public debt has gone up dramatically in recent years. And we have so much else that we have to do at the same time, like take some responsibility for our own defense, given that we can't rely on the US to defend Ukraine anymore. So we are in a different situation. I don't think that you can translate US policy to what Europe should do.
Cristina, should we be dependent on public funds in Europe? Because Trump seems to be showing that you don't need to be dependent on public funds, and he's changing, the CHIPS Act has been done away with, and he's turning towards private capital a little bit more.
Well, capital needs to come from the public purse, also from private sources. It's a combination of the two, it's private and public partnership. But I really resent the framing that says, generically, can Europe compete in a global supply chain? What does it mean? I'm asking you to be specific, because there isn't a thing which is called the chip. There are multiple chips in a range of sizes, in a range of maturity. Some of it is not even yet demanded in Europe. So we go from mature legacy chips, in which Europe is actually quite self-sufficient. All the stuff we need for IoT, for machinery, for cars. Thank you very much.
Sorry, Cristina, this is not going to be the case for long, because
China
can
you let me finish? Because I didn't. Can you let me finish?
Cristina, and then we'll ask you.
Can you let me finish? I'm saying today we are 10% of fabrication, and it is mostly in this mid-range. What we do not have, indeed, is the below 5 nodes, which is the future. Okay, but there hasn't been demand for it, there hasn't been fabrication for it, but there are plans now, is ESMC, there are plans now. We have 9 fabricators in Europe, and investment is going in. We don't have a massive demand. We are not the United States. These things are happening over time. But absolutely, I resent the notion that, oh, you don't have exactly the same amount of money, which isn't true, because there is a ton of money in Germany, there is a ton of money. Germany isn't going to let the car industry fall over. It is no scenario in which Germany lets the car industry fall over. We have AI defense absolute imperatives. We have demand, which is developing, and that is driving investment. I'm not saying let's stick with the legacy. There is investment going in, but I absolutely do not accept that it's okay for the US to want fabrication onshore, and for us, we have to rely on diplomacy. When President Trump is telling you have to buy my chips, or else.
Yeah, what do you think about in terms of the next iteration? Yes, we applause when we hear something we like. So the next iteration of chips, not just the ones that go into legacy cars, but that go into the future of cars to make autonomous driving a reality. Should that be on-sourced in Europe to a certain extent?
Look, I think that it's perfectly valid for Europe to want to protect its supply chains, and in some cases that may mean onshoring. In other cases, it's going to mean relying on international partners. You've got to take it, as Cristina says, it's a complex supply chain, not only the types of chips, but also all the steps in that process. And so there'll be some areas where we're good enough, many areas where we're good enough to compete on our own terms, and there'll be others where we rely on others. This is perfectly normal. The chip supply chain is full of specialization. So I really think it's a combination of things. The difference, and Cristina and Eric have both kind of asked us to be specific here, is that China and the US have much more control over the end-to-end supply chain, either by onshoring or by controlling what other countries are doing. And you can see the way that the US has leaned on Europe. In the case of Nexperia, this has been a key factor, but even before that, ASML, which is a European champion in chips, the US is pressuring the Dutch government, and it has been for years, to limit which countries ASML is allowed to export its machines to. This is completely intolerable. It's a European company, and if we want to be sovereign, we should be able to decide for ourselves what the future of our European chip companies are and who they're allowed to sell to. And so, to address this issue, it's about security. It's about a whole lot of things that are not just limited to the supply chain, because to the chip supply chain, that is.
So to help me understand, you're saying that ASML shouldn't be bullied by America, that they should leverage their chokehold a little bit more. Should they be allowing their machinery to go into China, therefore?
I don't know, but the point is that it should be Europeans that decide, right? And this is not currently
You're making my point for digital sovereignty, my friend. We are a digital colony. We are a digital colony, and we are not, and we need to regain the loss. You talk about China, though. Let's not confuse. China has been racing to independence or self-reliance, but they are really only mature chips. The Chinese are absolutely nowhere today, and for the foreseeable future, in advanced nodes. So let's also not get hysterical about what the Chinese are doing that's coming to eat our lunch. The Chinese are strong in a particular part of the supply chain. Europe is not yet in fabrication of these advanced chips, but it's moving. China isn't there yet. So it's much more nuanced.
And China is a lot closer than Europe in manufacturing advanced chips. It can do it, just not at scale or very efficiently. China.
And they don't have a single photovoltaic.
Let's hear from Jeff.
I was just going to say, on the legacy chips issues, it is a very real risk to Europe and frankly to many countries around the world that China, if you look out kind of 2-3 years, they are building all the fabs now that they want to completely global, they want to conquer the global market for legacy chips. This is a shared problem that frankly the United States and Europe and every other country around the world faces.
Once again, because we are naive. That's the reason for that.
Europe is not going to be able to solve this problem by itself. They are not going to be able to solve this problem by themselves. They're going to have to work with other partners to address the common challenge of China's overcapacity here. And I think a kind of Europe-first strategy is going to frankly kind of provoke.
No
other
one
countries.
is saying Europe protectionism, Europe first. I don't know where you get that from. Eurostack or sovereignty isn't about closing the borders. It's about trying to muscle up a little more what is at the moment a digital colony in which we are invaded by the United States. We are told what to do by the United States, and we fear the Chinese invasion. This is the reality. But Europe can do it. It is in a position to do it. And of course, we want to work with others. We are already working with Japan. We are already working with Korea. There is no presumption there that we shouldn't.
So, Eric, to your point, how much, when it comes to the thing of digital sovereignty, should Europe be in charge of its entire food chain in the same way that China is aiming to in the next iteration of chips? Do you think you will ultimately have to work with other players? Is that just the reality, but we should have a little bit more of an ability to manufacture at the same time as be able to do the IP, the design, maybe even have the raw materials? Do you want to go as far as having some of these rare earth metals here?
Once again, I think there is no doubt that Europe cannot control everything, that's for sure. And for
You seem to agree on that.
yeah, that's for sure. So then it's back to my question, is about how much of a cake can we get?
And you want more cake?
I want more cake, yes.
We do want more cake, a lot more.
We
cake.
all want more cake for Europe.
Yeah, you want our
And
cake.
it sounds that some countries, they don't want us to have any cake. Second is about, okay, we want not only to have some cake, but we want others to depend on us also a little bit. So that when we depend on them, we can balance that and we can negotiate. So that's a way, to make sure that you will not be dependent because the other guys also, they depend about you.
Is that not diplomacy? And to that point, therefore, how much cake do you feel Europe needs from where it is now to have the ability to exert its authority a bit more? How much should ASML be able, because it is basically apart from one Japanese creator,
Guys, we're talking only about one
equipment
company
maker.
called ASML. Come on.
Yeah.
Okay. Out of the 500 billions announced by Mr. Trump, how much will go in the pocket of ASML? A few, maybe 1 billion would be amazing, right? So this is how the cake is split. Now, coming back on dependency, if we've got a war, ASML machine is for next generation of manufacturing, 3, 4, 5 years. Well, it will be a great weapon for negotiation, for diplomacy. Nobody will care. Okay? No. We need to have our control. We need to have a much bigger part of the cake, and we need to be able to negotiate even when times are getting tough.
Completely agree. I mean, very well said. The difference, though, is that this is not the US and Chinese positions. They want to
Of
squeeze
course,
Europe
of
out.
course not.
And at the moment, they can, right? Like, you look at Trump's policies in trade on chips, and he wants to create these AI stacks and packages where if you want to buy anything from America in the AI value chain, you have to buy the AI models, you have to buy the chips, you have to use the US design. And so it's really making it extremely difficult for Europe to have countervailing leverage. And the number one reason for that is EU dependence on US defense. And so that has to be our first priority.
And Jeff, I want to go to that as in the opportunity cost was one that you tried to put across. If we're going to put public funds, public effort into the chip stack, well then defense tech has to take a back seat. Is that the way in which you see it?
I think so, right? I mean, look, the inconvenient truth here is that Europe has many dependencies at the moment, sort of built up over decades. And I sort of agree. I think many on the stage agree there's sort of a shift towards a more kind of autonomous, capable Europe should be welcomed in Europe and frankly will be welcomed in the United States, I think. The question is sort of, in a world of trade-offs and in a world of limited capital, where are you going to make your big bets? And I would offer that putting a big bet on the chip stack does not make sense relative to more sort of core defense. There's a huge need for a big buildup of the European defense industry. That is going to be expensive. It can take lots of effort, lots of energy, all the inputs that we've been talking about. Are we going to sort of sacrifice what we are doing on defense to instead make a big bet on chips? We have to make hard choices here.
Do you agree that it's an...
No, I think there is something
not either
I would
or.
like to clarify is, based on what you said, it looks like it will be a massive investment for Europe to be part of the game. And that was my point. I mean, these US companies, yes, they are investing hundreds of billions. I think that's stupid, personally. We don't need to do that. I agree, for sure. But does it mean that we need to give up? Not at all. Because when the market will be mature, Even if your chips are 10%, 20% less performant, who cares? Right, who cares? This is not important. So you need to be part of the game. Let them invest to be at the top. Let that waste hundreds and millions. But we need to invest so that we're part of the game.
Eric, what I'd love to start doing is involving the audience, because they are putting through some really interesting questions here. And there's one that I think already we could go into the world of regulation and money that's already been put to bear. Because Europe hasn't been without trying when you think about the way in which they want interoperability with Gaia X, when we've seen money be put into the first, what was seen as the CHIPS Act of Europe. Now we're thinking of a CHIPS Act 2.0. And from our audience, we're starting to hear about how the real problem is empowering action, actually, in Europe. And the question is how has already you been helped by Europe with regulation or incentives, or how have you yet to be unleashed with the help of more regulation or less, as the case may be?
So this is definitely something I can share, because it's been around for the last 10 years. And let's be honest, I mean, at Calais, we experienced firsthand the difficulties being a semiconductor in Europe. Difficulties to raise money, very, very difficult. But it's not only about money. It's also difficulties to build strategic partnership with early customers. But not so many companies willing to take risk to work in advance with companies like us in Europe. They prefer to work with US, with American guys. Difficulties to strike also strategic partnership. And also a lot of political talk and not so much actions. But what is very interesting is that it seems that things have been changing for the last 18 months. And for example, we at Calais, we just closed a strategic deal with another company in Spain called OpenChip, so that rather than competing, we can really help each other. We raised together more than $400 million, half of them coming from Europe. Okay. And we see also as part of the offers or tenders that now in Europe, being a European company is becoming criteria. Okay, so we definitely see a change.
Where was the other half of the money, by the way?
Investors, VCs, listed companies. Okay, so you can get it. Okay, so the point now is, I think, is that that's not enough. That's not enough. What is really missing is an access to the market. And it's back to the Draghi report. It's about making sure that companies like us, at a point of time, we've got a way to access the market so that we can learn, we can show to end customers that our products are good.
And Mario Draghi wrote a report about trying to incentivize growth and entrepreneurialism.
It may be 1%, 2%, 5% of the market first, and then little by little, so that we can penetrate this market. But without this market, how can we start deploying our product, showing our value, and learn? Okay, so it's not about money. Money is getting now easier to get. It's really about opening the market, but I think it's changing very fast.
When you're looking at, Jeff, when you're looking at prior examples of Europe trying to incentivize or subsidize or bring together and work as a whole, are you optimistic that we could see future regulatory changes that does incentivize more growth within?
So we'll see. I mean, look, I think, going back to Eric's point on sort of what size of the cake do we need? I think, there's this figure out there of sort of 20% of global supply, which is that sort of, Europeans have been throwing that out for decades, it feels like. And sort of back to sort of 2013, the goal was to get to 20% of global market. Sort of, the CHIPS Act a few years ago, restating goal to get 20% of the market. Meanwhile, they've basically sort of flatlined around sort of 10, 11%. So again, we've been hearing the idea of we need a bigger share for a very long time. And you guys have not seen anything that convinces me there's a credible path to get there. And again, I'm sort of open to hearing what that path is, but if you do not have these sort of big hundreds of billions of dollars that the US and China are going to be throwing at it to kind of get their piece of share, I don't know where it's coming from. I think there is a kind of procurement side, but procurement's not going to get you very far here.
So I'm not quite sure I want to listen to this condescendence with which you say you've been talking about 20% forever. The US has collapsed in fabrication in the last 30 years. You're nowhere. You're below 10%. And only because you're spending all this billion, you might get up to 15. So let's not get kind of crazy and thinking that what you're going to do is 80% of the market. No, you're still going to be below 20, okay? So let's just be clear. So
is that a right amount of the cake?
Well, the cake is divided between a number of people. The Taiwan has got the lion's share. Of course, the US is trying to grow. China is grown. Europe has been fairly stable around 8, 9, 10%, and there it remains. There is no prediction that Europe is going to collapse to 5%. None, zero, zilch. Go to every analyst report. It is still 8, 9, 10%. So we ain't doing too badly, okay? So we are not...
But is it self-sufficient with 8, 9?
The question is to do what? You know, this trope that somehow we need to be in the global war, I don't get it. We need to think about what we need, which is automotive, AI, defense. These kind of chips are in part mid-sized chips, in part new chips, and we've got the fabrication in train to do it. We have fabless, we have design, we have superpowers in Europe. We have the design that can actually, to the point of energy, trade power and heat and speed in a way that is actually very attractive. We have superheroes in design. We have, indeed, our old friend ASML, but not only. We have Zeiss, we have IMEC. We have a number of very capable players. Yes, okay, this is a world in which we are dependent. It hurts me and pains me that Europe has capitulated to the extent that it has to buy these 40 billion of chips. Was that because we wanted? No, because we were with our back against the wall and we were told we will not defend you very much. And against this background, you want us to say, okay, let's do diplomacy, let's be friends. No, we need to be more sovereign, we need to be doing more of our own stuff.
With what
We can't do that
regulation
without
to do it?
defense.
No, I'm not saying without defense. Of course we need that defense, but that's what I'm saying is that we are with our back against the wall and we have to accept this blackmailing, which involved this acquiring all these chips that we could possibly do also here. How? We have plans. There are plans, public-private partnerships. There is money coming from the state. As I say, Germany has got a lot of money. There is a lot of money at the Commission. This
So are
money
you
will flow.
confident that we will have made and have the manufacturing to make the chips of the future that will service
We
Europe
will
enough?
make a share of it.
The right size of cake.
I mean, as Eric says, the issue is access to market. Are we going to be able to sell? When you're looking at the gigafactories, people building the gigafactories are saying the only question is we will fill them with NVIDIA chips and Microsoft servers, or will we have some European customers in there? That is the question that we as Europeans need
So
to really
Europeans
respond.
need to buy European made. So how are you going to incentivize that? Is that something that regulation will bring to bear, Eric?
Well-
for Eric to make sure that he has the right customers. For
You
the
know,
chips that he manufactures?
I'm allergic to regulation in the sense that in Europe we spend so much time regulating and not building, and that has been one of our main problems. But for sure. We also have an upside-down procurement system. Do you know that in America, in the US, buy American is the default. In China, not even talk about it. In Korea, in Japan, buy Korean, buy Japanese. You know what the default is in Europe? Buy from everywhere. Because we're fair. It's like, are you serious? And if we decide that we are going to buy European, it's discriminatory. We're going to get the lawyers on our back. We're going to get the WTO on our back.
Eric, is that
we
true? Is that
serious?
something you feel?
Yeah, it is very true. It is very true. Of course, I've been trying to do business in China. If you're not Chinese, you cannot. That's for sure. It's obvious. America, of course, when they look at European companies, they say, hey, guys, come on, you're in Europe. So I think I think for me there are three questions. The first one is, okay, should we compete? I think definitely yes.
And I think your agreement would be yes,
Yes.
you should compete.
Second one is, can we compete? And that's my point. I think we don't need hundreds of billions of cash. Okay, yes, we can. And the third question is it a fair game? And so do we need to play fair or unfair? And now, let's look at the others. How does US try to bring back manufacturing? Tariff. Is that fair? How is China catching up? Imposing their own champion. Is that fair? And we in Europe? Yes, we're open. It's freedom. Guys,
Come in.
enjoy. Open
So
bar.
you would want to see either use of tariffs or indeed
I think we
ensuring
need
that you have
to
to...
recognize this game is not fair. It's so important. We've been so naive for years.
Yes.
This game is not fair. So now let's think about it. Okay, how we make our own rules so we're going to win. That's simple.
Is there... Yes, sir. Would you disagree with that, Jeff? That maybe regulation needs to be more pro-European companies buying European manufactured chips?
So look, I certainly agree that the global market for chips is not a sort of fair level playing field, the sort of neoliberal ideal of perfect competition. It is very obviously not the case. This is a kind of government structured and government run market kind of throughout. And that is absolutely true. And the United States and China have decided this is a top national priority, a sort of nearly existential priority, and are going to put all of the weight and power of their governments behind this question. So the question is like, is Europe going to be in a position to do the same? Again, I frankly just do not see Europe kind of marshaling the power of the state behind this as a national priority in the same way that the US and China are going to do. They've got other issues. They've got sort of various other constraints that are facing them, sort of energy, bureaucratic, regulatory, all these things. Again, is there sort of marginal changes we can make on procurement policy? Possibly, but like, is that going to get you to a kind of super competitive European chip system? I don't see it.
Zach, we have more questions from the audience that I'm going to start folding in. And one of them is about when you think about the opportunity cost of defense tech versus investing in chips and the full tech stack. Well, have you got a unified idea of what Europe looks like and how they're going to agree to defense tech investment, let alone chip tech investment? How do you think we can have as one feeling around Europe? Because a lot of the issues with regulation is that countries want to compete one-on-one against each other in Europe rather than see each other as a whole.
Yeah, and I mean, this is a really key point, right? So the Draghi report is something that we all talk about in Europe today. It was a series of recommendations to make the single market work so countries are not competing against each other. But you read it, and 5 years ago, you saw reports that said the same thing. 10 years ago, you saw exactly the same thing. 15 years ago, you saw the same thing. The Lisbon strategy, the Monti report, these are not new ideas. And so even now, when it's more important than ever that we have a single market in Europe and that we speak as one voice, the political reforms are just not happening. You know, a think tank recently found that 11% of Draghi's recommendations were being picked up and on the path to adoption. Like, this is insane. Like, this is an existential crisis for Europe.
Well,
and
we don't disagree.
we're not taking it seriously.
No.
And the question is, if we're not now, when things are so dire for Europe, it doesn't seem like we ever can.
Defense and tech are not an either or. Much of the investment that goes into tech is defense investment, because we're talking about chips that go into drones, that go into equipment. So we are not talking about two things that are competing necessarily. And of course, I mean, if you take the debate to, is Europe a wonderful kind of institution where we do everything right? Come on, why we're in the gutter if that's the case? It's not. But the point is, can we Europeans do something? I am not pessimistic. You say you don't see a path. What do you want? A roadmap? It's not going to happen from
We're quite good at
digital
roadmaps. It's just following.
Yeah, but it's not going to happen from Europe. But there is a swell of businesses in Europe which are doing, investing, buying, selling. And this effort is real because demand is there, because the necessity is there, because the geopolitical environment has made this essential.
But Eric, can you depend on Germany, on Hungary, on Poland buying your chips?
Of course.
Is it happening?
Yes, of course. I mean, of course, you license a lot of IP from very different countries, tools, working with Siemens, for example. Of course.
But I think we're buying a lot more NVIDIA chips, to be fair, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, okay, very good. Fabulous.
And there's not really a path out of that that we can see.
So we give up. We just roll over under the sofa.
Is there a path out of that? Is there a way in which the AI, the part of the chips that you're supplying at the moment, can be used instead of an NVIDIA? Or you think that Europe can build a champion that we won't need to rely on an NVIDIA in Europe?
So we're back to unfair game. Okay, so the current situation is that there is a kind of de facto monopoly of NVIDIA right now on the market, full stop. Right, and mainly actually based on their CUDA ecosystem. Okay, everybody is using CUDA, and that's, they did very well.
For those who haven't heard of CUDA before.
Yeah, well, so basically it's the way you program on top of GPUs, and they impose their own proprietary environment. So basically, if you're a researcher, if you're a student, you use their GPU, so basically whatever you develop runs only on NVIDIA. So it's a massive issue, and they've played very, very well. It's a standard business practice. It's a little bit unfair, but standard business practice. And so that's why I said that by playing smart, by pushing open source, by also playing competition amongst the main US players, because that's something that we can leverage as European, then we can unblock the industry.
How much of the cake should Europe have versus NVIDIA in the GPU and future AI accelerator business?
I would tend to say that if Europe can get 15 to 20% of a market share, that will be enough for first attract VCs, right? Because the cake is so big that if you can guarantee that 15% of the market share will be allocated to European players, I can guarantee you that tomorrow I will raise billions, right? Market is so big. And then that means that because we will start having a market, then we will be very, very relevant also for manufacturing, right? Because if you don't have any volume production, nobody wants to install manufacturing capabilities, right? So it's a vicious circle. Okay. So once again, and it can take place in five years. It's not about tomorrow. So I think we can be smart, definitely.
I'll go to another audience question. In that being smart, Jeff, should Europe be manufacturing in Europe by bringing TSMC over to build in Germany, to bringing Intel and then Intel pulling out of building in Germany? Or should there be more of an ideal that a European fabric company should be building here?
So look, my view is that Europe, by being open to foreign investment, again, I would kind of put some caveats on it in terms of sort of allied governments. I would sort of think we should have sort of, big Chinese companies coming in to build all of our chips here for sure. But I do think Europe kind of working with other allied companies is a good path forward. But again, I have a question, how much of that needs to actually be built in Europe versus kind of have a broader distributed kind of manufacturing supply chain here. And I understand, the United States is making a big push to onshore a lot of chip making, but they're also very realistic that they're not going to bring everything back onshore. There's still going to be a sort of friendshoring component. And again, Europe and the United States are going to have to work together on these issues.
I'm interested, Cristina, on that point. We have seen rumblings and reporting coming from Bloomberg News that the EU is potentially looking at taking a leaf out of China's book. Maybe they would say, okay, if you build here, you need to share some of your IP with us. We need to be understanding exactly what sort of technology is being used, and there needs to be a sharing and a reciprocity that has always been expected in China when you go over and manufacture with a partner. Is that something that would look good as a regulatory response?
Well, that's for discussion. The reality is that no one is actually at the moment contemplating a purely TSMC or Chinese manufacturer in Europe. There is consortia. This is the way to go. There are consortia, NXP, Infineon, Bosch, Global Foundries, creating consortia in Dresden. And yes, Dresden, yes, because that's where the car industry also is. And that's why we need them there. It is all very well to say, you don't need them all in Europe. Well, we need quite a bit in Europe because we need those chips for what? Assisted driving cars, all of those things which are existential to Europe. We're not just talking about nice to have. It is an absolute core industry for Europe, and defense, again, and AI. So these things are happening. I break it to you, this is not just a pipeline dream. It is currently happening in very large measure because of what is happening elsewhere, because of the concern that we are going to be locked out, because of the concern that we are being competed against unfairly, we're going to be coerced against. So this is happening, and I absolutely refuse to believe that we are at the end of time and we should give up. This is again something that, as a narrative, as Europeans, we should refute. We know that when things happen, COVID, we just do it, okay? And so I don't think we should just roll around and say, well, okay, it's too late, let's do something small and cute so that they can help us with.
And with a lasting statement there, Zach, do you think it is that you're demanding something small and cute of Europe, or is it that you're saying there's different parts that should be the focus? Or rather than trying to go for an entire, should there be an ability that if all the taps got turned off internationally, Europe should still be able to build its own AI chip at the future?
No, I mean, the strengths that Europe has are incredible, and they're incredibly important to the supply chain. They are indispensable. And so these aren't cute, fun little things. Lithography is not cute and fun. I mean, the amounts of money that ASML spends on R&D are extraordinary, and there's a reason why China and the US can't catch up. So when we look at why why Europe isn't able to compete in the chip war, it's not about that we don't have the companies. It's about we are beholden to the US for things like defense. We require China for things like rare earths. And so, so this isn't cute stuff. If we are able to leverage ourselves as an international player, if we can speak with United Europe, we really ought to be able to have a better leverage in international discussions and to be able to rely on other countries that have what we need as well.
But you keep going back to the same language. Europe cannot compete. What does compete mean? Does it mean a price war? Does it mean flooding the market?
But Cristina, I started my opening remarks by defining the chip war, right? How is China and the US different to other countries?
Yeah.
And the reason is they have so much control and ambitions to control the end-to-end supply chain, to
For
coerce
themselves,
other countries
yes.
in terms of what their policies are, in terms of who they sell to,
Yes.
or where they're allowed to invest, whether they're forced to buy US chips or not. We aren't in a position to do the same.
I think this is a good moment to then be summarising our arguments and see if anyone's minds have shifted, because our debaters get a whopping 90 seconds each to sum up their closing statements and to make their final case to the audience. I'm pleased to say that almost giving some of that summation was Zach, so I'm going to start with Zach Meyers, arguing Europe is too late to compete in the chip war. Zach, give us your last 90-second push to convince the audience.
Thank you, Caroline. We've spoken so much in this debate today about what the size of the pie is and how much Europe is entitled to. And that isn't really what this debate is about. Obviously, Europe can compete at various points, but what distinguishes us from the US and China is the control that they can leverage over the end-to-end supply chain, which is in part because of the strengths they have in parts of that supply chain, but it's also because of things like security and the military investments and the reliance that the EU has on the US. And so, this isn't about giving up. Actually, I think our side strongly believe that Europe has a bright future in a lot of the chip supply chain. But this isn't a discussion about the size of the pie. This is about what we can do to make sure that we are indispensable and that we can rely on other countries and treat them as reliable partners. And to do that, we need to build up on our strengths and not just try to plaster over our weaknesses. That's never been how the chip supply chain works.
30 seconds to spare. Zach, we thank you for summation. Next up to give closing remarks is Eric Baissus. Eric, you're arguing it's not too late for Europe. Please tell us why.
No, it's not too late. And I would like to give you an example of why it's not too late. Let's imagine you are in the 60s. IBM just actually launched their new mainframe. It cost a fortune, right? It's a result of IBM research centers and the result of decades of scientific progress. It's the beginning of a new era, the computing era. Now imagine you are a company in the 60s or a government. You want to be part of this game, right? Part of this industry. What do you think? Would you buy thousands of these mainframe costing a fortune? Whereas you know that in 2 or 5 years, they will be completely obsolete. Or will you buy a few of them, learn from them, and invest in what will be important for the next battle? This is where we are in terms of AI. Let US invest billions and billions and billions in buying GPUs. We don't care. They basically evangelize the market. They help us understand what we can do with AI. Now, yes, let's leverage our strength. Let's focus and invest on what will be the next wave. The next wave will be about power. The next wave will be about trust, security. The next wave will be about having an AI that you can trust, that share your own culture, that share your own value. This is something we can do because these are the strengths of Europe. We can make it.
Eric, we thank you. Jeff Gertz is up next. Geoffrey, tell us why it is too late for Europe to compete.
Great, wonderful. Thank you, Caroline. So again, thanks to everybody for joining us here. So look, I think there's a lot we agree with on this stage. I think we agree semiconductors are a key sector that have both economic and geopolitical spillovers, and so are kind of important, more important than the kind of average run-of-the-mill sector for nations developing their own kind of long-term strategies here. We also agree there are real sort of pockets of success in Europe's semiconductor sector. Sort of, we've talked about ASML a lot today. Obviously, nobody here that thinks that ASML kind of cannot compete, right? That is sort of a foolish statement to say. But we also know that there's sort of real vulnerabilities that face this sector. We've talked a little bit about critical rare earths. Again, that's a kind of core vulnerability that Europe needs to address. And I think there are also vulnerabilities thinking about kind of core defense chips, and it makes sense to have a sort of small pocket of chips available for core defense needs. Europe does need that. But I think kind of the question really here is like, does it make sense for Europe to go in to sort of say, yes, we want to be a competitor in the chip war? I go back to this question Cristina raised, sort of what does it really mean to be competitive here? Again, I think it means Europe is choosing to say, yes, we want to keep pace with the US and China. We want to be a player in the space. And I don't think there's a sort of path forward for that. So That's not to say, again, we all agree, I think, nobody's calling for Europe to give up on semiconductors altogether, but you need to be smart and strategic in choosing where you are deploying limited capital, limited energy, limited sort of frankly bureaucratic and political willpower, and it's not clear that a big chip strategy is the place to go.
Well said. Geoffrey, we thank you. And lastly, we hear from Cristina.
Well, I'm afraid there
Caffarra.
is a lot we disagree with on this panel. And I think that to the definition that Zach came up with, we continue to hear compete in the chip wars. And your definition is, can Europe be in any way near the way in which the US and China dominate the global, the end-to-end, these are the words you use, global supply chains. The US is nowhere near the end-to-end supply chain. You are screwed when it comes to rare minerals. You don't have fabrication which compares to your ambitions, and you don't have anything like lithographic of your own. So look, end-to-end global supply chains, I beg to differ. And then China, as we discussed, has got a lot in the mature end, is nowhere in the advanced stuff. So what are we talking about? Europe is similarly in a position of having significant strengths in other ways. All we hear is we don't have the billions. As we hear, throwing billions at data center may not be very smart going forward. So I think we're being gaslit. Frankly, this is the trope that Europe cannot compete, is something which is being thrown at us. It is completely non-credible. When globalization was a collective drug, we accepted that it was fine to have somewhat regional specialization. It is no longer acceptable for Europe to be relying on others in the rest of the world to the extent that it does. We need to build capacity locally. Of course, we do not have as an objective or a realistic goal independence, but we need to build more, and that is non-negotiable.
Cristina, thank you. Now, folks, we've heard from all our debaters' arguments. I'm actually interested as to what argument landed from either side, what part of the debate you hadn't heard before, what trope you felt was true or wasn't. So I'm going to start with you, Zach. Was there anything you heard from the opposing side that it's not too late, that you hadn't heard or made you pause and think?
Yeah, and this is a really good question to ask, so thank you for that. I think it kind of helps us have a constructive end to the debate. And I really liked Eric's point at the start that that there, in a lot of parts of the supply chain, there aren't barriers to entry for Europe. Where I think he might maybe be underestimating is the degree of political pressure that the US is putting on Europe and on the rest of the world to squeeze them out of parts of the supply chain where they can compete.
And to that point, the political power or leverage, I ask you, Cristina, maybe part of the argument from this side was about whether or not ASML is doing enough to exert its power. Was there anything that you heard from this side that did make you pause, think, reallocate the way in which you think Europe can move forward?
Look, I like these guys, but I haven't heard anything that I really hadn't heard before. So let's leave it at that.
Wah, wah. Nothing new, nothing.
No, sorry.
Brutal. Eric, is there anything that gave you an idea of moving forward in the way in which your own ambition, how much more political will you could see from, we're starting to see it with the Dutch government, for example?
Well, I would tend to say that there is definitely an agreement here is that Europe did not very well in the last decades, right? And so I think the big difference between this guy and our is we are optimistic that this can change, right? Whereas you are pessimistic.
Realistic.
Or realistic. I mean,
Gaslighting.
you believe that it will. It will continue. Europe will still struggle to against pressure from other countries, struggling between the different countries. My view is that it's changing right now, and I think that the pressure actually. We suffer from pressure, but we also can leverage this pressure because it's a way to wake up.
Jeff, anything that you hadn't heard before gave you pause, made you think?
So, I mean, look, one point that I do think was quite helpful to hear is the view from the other side of sort of maybe Europe has been playing by the rules too much and should be a bit more of a geopolitical actor. I actually think that's quite welcome. And I think it's sort of something we agree on. And frankly, I agree sort of, Europe has more sort of leverage to push if it really wants to. I would say, again, I think, speaking just for myself, but in the United States, it'd be kind of very helpful to have a stronger, more capable Europe on the world stage. I think the United States needs a stronger, more capable Europe. So I would sort of love nothing more to see Europe sort of fully stand up. I think, it's a hard track here. Again, I'm not sure this is the sort of single issue that they should be most focused on, but I sort of support a stronger, independent Europe.
Thank you for those takes. And I think it was a really healthy way to end the debate and to learn from each other, even if there's nothing that Cristina hasn't heard before. But what Cristina hasn't heard before is the results from this room. So let's bring them up. We have understood the way in which you have been voting. We're going to see it on our audience polling now. Is Europe too late to compete in the chip war? 55% originally said yes, it is too late. And no, not too late was 25%, and it has shifted significantly, I'm afraid, folks on my left, or your stage right, that no, it is not too late has won out significantly. You've managed to convince a significant proportion of you in the room. Now 58% are going to walk away a little bit more optimistic with Europe's place in the world when it comes to the chip stack, and 58% think it's not too late. 39% now say, yes, it's too late. So congratulations to our winners who say, no, it is not too late. And that concludes our program. I want to thank our audience for your questions. They were wonderful. I was so pleased to be able to ask so many of them. Thanks to our teams at Open to Debate and at Bloomberg who made all of this a reality through our partnership. Finally, huge thanks to such a wonderful set of debaters today. Zach, Geoffrey, Cristina, Eric, for approaching this debate with an open mind, maybe not Cristina, or for bringing your thoughtful disagreement to the table. That is what you brought, Cristina, and for being open to debate, everyone.